And Glaucon also tells the story about the ring of Gyges, where a ring that makes you invisible, and if you had such a ring, of course you would be better off if you just did whatever you wanted without getting caught. Justice is there as a compromise that we all make with society. Okay, I won't hurt you, you won't hurt me, we'll both be better off that way, and we'll punish people who break that agreement because it's damaging to the person who suffers injustice. But if I could get away with it, I would still do injustice. And it's fortunate for both of us that we've been able to come to this agreement. But as soon as I can be confident that I will get away with my injustice, of course I would be better off to commit it. And if I'm a wise and strong person, of course I will commit it. And so this is the challenge that is made to Socrates. And once that challenge has been made, he responds, Socrates has been asked by Glaucon to defend justice by itself, to defend justice not for the sake of things which come from it, like reputation or the kind of game theory reasons or social contract theory reasons, which Glaucon outlines in the challenge, but to give an account of why justice is good by itself. And the answer Socrates gives is the following. The investigation we're undertaking is not an easy one, but requires keen eyesight. Therefore, since we aren't clever people, we should adopt the method of investigation that we'd use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to read small letters from a distance, and then notice the same letters existed elsewhere in a larger size and on a larger surface. We'd consider it a godsend, I think, to be allowed to read the larger ones first, and then to examine the smaller ones, to see whether they really are the same. So this it seems to be backing up the analogical interpretation, the idea being that you have one thing, you have another thing that's like it, you're trying to find out the truth about the thing that's like it, namely the soul. So we're going to use the city as an expository device because it's bigger, it's easier to understand. And then once we're done doing that, we'll apply those things to the soul to answer the question we were asked, to get at the thing we were trying to prove in the first place. At the end, when the sketch of the city is more or less complete, Socrates says, let's apply what has come to light in the city to an individual. And if we do this and compare them side by side, we might well make justice light up as if we were rubbing fire sticks together. The same kind of idea. Then later on in books 8 and 9, when he talks about the ideal soul and the different kinds of souls, he talks about them with reference to different kind of regimes based on his illustrations of the city. So over here, the person whose soul is dominated by reason has an aristocratic soul, a soul that's ruled by the best. The best thing in you is reason. This is exactly how the ideal city works. The rulers are on top, they give orders down. That's the way it's supposed to work in the ideal person's soul. The second best soul is the timocratic soul. It's the soul ruled by spirit. This is not as good as reason because spirit doesn't have the technical masterly knowledge to look towards the good of the whole, but at least it can still have the power to regulate the unruly appetites in the person. The third best kind of soul, also the third worst kind of soul, is a soul. There are three kinds of appetites. There are the necessary, there are the unnecessary, and there are the unlawful. So the third best kind of city is the one that's ruled by necessary appetites. This is an oligarchy. Oligarchs procure the basic necessities of life, and they procure them in excess. Things like money, supplies, material goods. The third worst kind of soul is the one that's dominated by those. The second worst kind of soul is the democratic soul. It is one that is governed by unnecessary appetites. The idea being that in a democracy, the people vote for whatever they're feeling like today. They feel like something different tomorrow. Democracies do a lot of things that are unnecessary. They ignore a lot of concerns that are necessary, just kind of whatever way the appetitive winds blow them. So a person whose soul is dominated by unnecessary appetites has a democratic soul. And then you have the worst kind of soul, which is the tyrannical soul, is governed by lawless or unlawful appetites. these are people like psychopaths or serial killers. They're the worst kind of person you could possibly be. The basest, least noble, most evil desires in them dominate their soul the same way a tyrant dominates his city. So this is the kind of outline of, good kinds of souls and how they are analogous to different kinds of different kinds of cities. And The Republic on this view is a book about how to make the individual human being the most happy, how to make the individual human being live the best kind of life. And that's the kind of life which is guided by reason. Now, that's the analogical view. What we want to do now is consider whether this view is correct. Firstly, I would like to say that the analogical view is at least partially correct. The state and the soul do have analogous structures. Socrates is quite explicit that this kind of lineup is right. There are 3 parts of the city. There are 3 parts of the soul. There are 3 kinds of appetites. There are 3 kinds of regimes that are dominated by appetite. So the analogy definitely stands. But the analogical claim is trying to say something more than that. It's trying to say that the city in the Republic is nothing more than an expository device for the soul. The analogical claim as made by Julia Annis and a lot of other people who have been in a similar intellectual mode of thought have said that the only reason Plato talks about a city, the only reason is to elucidate this particular structure of the soul. Now, I completely agree that the analogy stands both in the literature and in the philosophy of Plato. The question is that the reason that he introduces the city? Is the city only an illustrative device, or does Plato actually think there are cities, the good city would have this structure, and it is not a mere accident that there's an analogy between the city and the soul, but that the reason there's an analogy between the city and the soul is because cities produce people that mimic the constitution in the city. So that's one thing I do want to take from the analogical interpretation, is that there is this kind of analogy in the Republic. The second thing I want to take is that they've got the ethics more or less right. The analogical interpretation is essentially about ethics. And I agree with their ethical interpretation, that a good person for Plato is one whose reason is in command, who uses their spirit to check the excesses of their appetites, who would focus on necessary appetites before unnecessary ones, etc. However, neither of these 2 things, which I want to take from the analogical interpretation, commits us to the view that this is the only explanation for the city, that we could have gotten by through this whole book without talking about a city at all. We could have just had Socrates tell us, well, keep your reason in command, have your spirit moderate your unnecessary appetites, and you'll be good. I think there's a reason why Socrates goes into the city, and so that's why I want to investigate further. Now, on the analogical claim, almost everything in books 2 to 5 you have to hold as corresponding to something in the human soul. With the 3 classes, we see how that could sort of work. There's also a lot of discussion in books 2 to 5 about what kind of poetry we're going to allow in the city. Could we say that, when we say we don't want to allow the excesses of the Homeric poems into our city, that we're supposed to be regulating the kind of passionate appetites that those poems call up, inside of ourselves? Maybe we could say that. But there's a lot of other things in the account of the city that don't really compute. Socrates says there will be no nuclear family in the city. Women and children will be held in common in the city. Women will participate in traditionally male occupations in the ideal city. There will be a noble lie that causes all citizens to believe they're born from the earth. There will be no sexual love between men and young boys. What does it mean to translate these into analogies for parts in the ideal soul? What does it mean to say there's no nuclear family in my soul? It really doesn't compute. What does it mean to say that all the citizens in my soul have to think they're born from the earth? It doesn't translate quite as well. It's something of a stretch. We'll take questions at the end. So if we're going to say that the city is just an expository device for the soul,